Feral by Night is a storytelling series of eerie tales, strange houses, hauntings, weird things that happen on lonely roads, and all the things that go bump in the night. I'm Papa G, and this is Feral by Night. So turn the lights down and settle in. Some stories are better heard after dark. Peter heard his own tires hit gravel on the radio 10 seconds before the truck left the pavement. He had been driving home from the warehouse after a 12-hour shift, with his hands stiff around the steering wheel and his eyes sore from the kind of fluorescent light that makes the whole world look washed out afterward. It was close to midnight, and the storm that had moved through earlier had left the back roads slick and shining under his headlights. The highway was blocked by a wreck near the overpass, so Peter had taken Bellwether Road, the old two-lane that cut past the creek bottoms and came out behind the closed feed mill. He hated that road at night. Everybody who grew up around there knew it dipped too low in places, and the trees leaned in over both lanes until the branches met above the yellow line. His radio had been playing classic country from a station 40 miles away. But near the creek bridge, the signal thinned out and dissolved into static. Peter reached for the knob. Before he touched it, he heard gravel through the speakers. It was sharp and familiar, the sound of tires leaving blacktop and small stones striking the undercarriage. His right hand stopped halfway to the radio. Then the truck itself bumped hard, and his actual tires slid onto the gravel shoulder. He jerked the wheel left and got back into his lane. His pulse kicked once in his throat. He glanced at the radio, expecting the static to settle back into music, but the speaker gave another soft hiss, followed by the faint, steady sound of an engine. It was his engine, idling through the speakers a half second ahead of the truck itself. Peter turned the radio off. The dash went dark, but the sound kept coming through anyway. For a few seconds, he only stared at it. The truck was old, a 1996 Ford that had belonged to his father. The wiring had always been temperamental. Sometimes the dome light stayed on. Sometimes the driver's side window went halfway down on its own. A radio acting strange wasn't enough to panic over. Then the speaker gave a small click. Peter heard his turn signal through the radio. 3 slow ticks sounded from the speaker before his own signal began blinking on the dash. He hadn't touched it, but a second later, the right signal came on by itself, blinking toward a turn that wasn't there. Peter slapped it off. The radio clicked 3 more times in the dark, as if something on the other side of the static had already seen him do it. Bellwether Road ran straight through a low patch of woods where old farmhouses sat far back from the road. Most of them had been empty for years. Their porches sagged, their windows were boarded, and their mailboxes leaned over like they were tired of waiting. Peter's grandmother used to say a person shouldn't leave a radio searching for a station in the bottoms. She said a dead frequency could pick up things that still wanted to be heard. Peter had never taken that seriously. She had said the same sort of thing about mirrors during storms and shoes left upside down by the door. But right then, with the dead radio breathing static into the cab, he remembered exactly how serious she had looked. He reached for his phone on the passenger seat and saw there was no service. Of course, there wasn't. The creek bottom always swallowed signal. A woman's voice came through the speakers. It was faint at first, buried under static, but it had the flat, pleasant tone of someone reading local announcements from a small radio station that had been on the air too long. Peter couldn't make out the first few words. Then the static dipped, and the voice became clearer. The voice said a driver was coming through the low stretch of Bellwether Road just after midnight. Peter's foot eased off the gas. The voice said the driver was alone, in an old blue Ford truck. He looked down at the dark radio. The truck coasted under the trees while rainwater dripped from the branches and struck the windshield in slow, heavy drops. Then the voice said the driver's name was Peter Fowler. He hit the brakes. The truck slowed in the middle of the road, headlights fixed on wet blacktop and the silver trunks of trees. Static hissed around his name as though the radio had swallowed it and was still trying to make room for it. Peter shoved the gear shift into park and turned the key off. The engine died, but the headlights stayed on, and the radio kept playing. Now the speakers carried the soft sound of him breathing. He held his breath, and the breathing on the radio stopped too. He sat in the dead truck listening to rainwater drip from the trees. The road behind him was black in the rearview mirror. No headlights, no house lights in the distance, no sign of the highway or town. Only the wet shine of Bellwether Road disappearing behind him. The woman's voice returned. It said the driver had stopped where he shouldn't have stopped. Peter turned the key. The engine coughed once, then caught. He slammed the truck back into drive and pulled forward hard enough for the tires to spit water behind him. The voice continued, calm and steady, saying he would pass the white mailbox on the right. A few seconds later, a white mailbox appeared in his headlights. It was old, rusted around the hinge with no house visible behind it. Peter remembered passing it earlier before the creek bridge. He was sure of it. The mailbox had been on the left then. He kept driving, and the voice said he would pass the white mailbox again. The road bent left, then straightened out beneath the trees. His headlights reached forward, and there it was again. Same white mailbox, same rust along the hinge, same red flag hanging halfway down. This time, something stood beside it. At first, Peter thought it was a fence post. Then the shape lifted its head. It was a person, but the proportions were wrong in the way things look wrong when headlights catch them too quickly. Too tall through the neck, too narrow at the shoulders. One arm hung longer than the other, nearly to the ditch grass. Peter didn't slow down. As he passed, the figure turned with the truck. He didn't see a face. He only saw the pale oval where one should have been, and the dark holes where the eyes might have been. The radio filled with static so loud that Peter flinched. Under it, he heard tapping. 3 taps on glass. The sound didn't come from the windshield. It came from the passenger window. He kept his eyes on the road. Every part of him wanted to look over, but he held his gaze straight ahead and gripped the wheel until his fingers began to ache. The tapping came again, right beside him. 3 patient taps. Then the woman on the radio said the driver was trying hard to keep from looking. Peter pressed the gas. The truck surged forward, but the road seemed longer than it should have been. The trees kept repeating. Same bend, same leaning pine, same ditch full of brown water, same white mailbox waiting ahead. When the mailbox appeared for the 3rd time, the figure beside it was closer to the road. Peter drove past without turning his head. The passenger window fogged from the outside, and something traced a line through the fog with one thin finger. Peter saw it from the corner of his eye. just enough to know letters were being formed backward against the glass. He refused to read them. The radio voice changed. It was still the same woman, still calm, but now there was something pleased under the words. She said the driver had been told better when he was a boy. She said he knew the rule about dead stations. She said he knew what happened when a person listened too long. Peter remembered his grandmother's hand snapping the radio off in her kitchen whenever static rose between songs. He remembered being maybe 7 years old, sitting at her table while rain tapped the tin awning outside. She had told him that voices didn't always need a mouth. Some things only needed a way in. Back then, he had laughed. She had made him promise anyway. If a dead station ever said his name, he was supposed to turn around before the road heard him answer. Peter gripped the wheel harder. He had already stopped. He had already listened. The road had already heard him breathing. Ahead, the trees opened. For one relieved second, he thought he had reached the feed mill. Then his headlights fell across an old roadside pull-off he didn't recognize. A gravel half-circle sat beside the road with a collapsed picnic table and a payphone standing crooked under a dead security light. The phone began to ring as he passed it. The ringing followed through the radio. It rang once, twice, then a third time before the woman's voice said his mother was calling. Peter's foot slipped off the gas. His mother had been dead for 6 years, but the ringing kept going with a hollow sound, like it was coming from inside a room with bare walls. Peter stared straight ahead until his eyes watered. The road narrowed and branches scraped the sides of the truck. The passenger window still held the backward writing in the fog, but he didn't look long enough to read it. The radio said his mother wanted him to stop. Then it said she was cold. The truck bucked as if the engine had missed. Peter pressed the gas, but the speedometer dropped from 40 to 30, then 20. The wheel began to tremble. The headlights dimmed until the road ahead turned the color of dirty water. The ringing stopped, and in the sudden quiet, Peter heard a seatbelt click. The passenger seatbelt pulled itself slowly across the empty seat and latched. He turned his head before he could stop himself. The seat was empty, but the cushion was pressed down, as though someone had just settled there. The woman on the radio said the driver had looked, and Peter slammed his eyes forward. The truck rolled toward the white mailbox again, but now the figure beside it was gone. The mailbox door hung open. Something dark had been tucked inside. As he passed, the radio crackled, and a new sound came through the speakers. A child was humming. Peter knew that tune. His grandmother used to hum it when she cooked. She had hummed it under her breath the day they buried his mother. The humming moved from the speakers to the back seat, and Peter felt the cab change around him. The space behind his shoulders seemed deeper than it should have been. He smelled wet wool, old leaves, and creek mud. In the rearview mirror, a hand rose slowly over the back of the bench seat. It was small and gray, with thin fingers that curled over the vinyl. Peter didn't scream. He couldn't get enough breath for it. He only drove, because driving was the last instruction left in his body. The road finally broke open ahead. This time, the lights in the distance were real. The feed mill appeared beyond the trees, its metal silos silver under the clouds. Past it were the first houses on the edge of town, their porch lights burning yellow in the rain. His phone buzzed on the seat as service returned. The radio shrieked with static. Every speaker in the truck rattled. The woman's voice came through one last time, louder than before, and said the driver had left the low road, but something had left with him. Then the radio went silent. Peter didn't stop until he reached his driveway. He parked crooked, left the keys on the seat, and went inside without locking the truck. His hands shook so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the house key into the front door. Inside, he turned on every light and sat at the kitchen table until the sky began to pale. At dawn, Peter walked back outside. The truck sat in the driveway, wet and ordinary. The passenger window was clear. The radio was dark. There was no sign of mud on the seat, no handprint on the glass, and no impossible weight pressing into the cushion. Then Peter saw the mailbox at the end of his driveway. It had always been black. That morning, it was white. Rust marked the hinge. The red flag hung halfway down. The little door stood open, and inside was a folded square of paper, damp around the edges. Peter didn't want to touch it, but he already knew he would. He unfolded it with 2 fingers. The paper was blank except for a time written in neat pencil. 12:07 a.m. Behind him, inside the locked truck, the radio turned on by itself. Static filled the driveway. Then the woman's voice began calmly describing the light in Peter's bedroom window. Only then did Peter understand what the white mailbox meant. Bellwether Road hadn't ended at the feed mill, and whatever lived inside that dead station hadn't stayed behind in the creek bottom. It had followed the sound of his breathing all the way home, carrying a piece of the road with it, until his own driveway had become part of the same place he thought he'd escaped. The radio wasn't predicting the drive anymore. It was announcing that his house had been tuned in 2, and that something from the passenger seat was already inside, waiting for him upstairs. Feral by Night is the sister podcast to The Feral Folklorist. You can find information on both podcasts on feralfolklorist.com. And if you'd like to see the animated video versions of these stories, consider becoming a patron on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. And if you're ever in the market for metaphysical supplies, our store, Aromagees Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at aromagees.com.